Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for People for Bikes Better Bike Advocacy Workshop. This is the third in a series of workshops focused on giving you the tools you need to be an effective advocate for better biking in your community. Today, we will focus on building powerful, inclusive coalitions, but our previous two workshops, which are available on our YouTube page, focus on effective messaging and community engagement tactics for advocates. So we encourage you to check those out if you're interested. Today, I'm Martina Haggerty. I'm the Vice President of Infrastructure, and I am so pleased to be joined by three amazing advocates from across the country working in Minneapolis, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. I'll introduce those three panelists a little bit later in the presentation, but first I wanted to go over our agenda for today and talk a little bit about People for Bikes. People for Bikes is a national advocacy organization that promotes better biking in everyone's backyard. We're also the trade association for the bike industry in the United States. I'm going to give a sneak peek of some of the tools and resources that People for Bikes has available before diving into our guide to effective local bike advocacy with you today, which this advocacy workshop series is based upon. Then we're going to hear from our three local advocates who are here as panelists, and we'll share a bit about coalition building that they've done in the communities that they work with and in. And then we'll have some time at the end for a short Q&A session. So please enter any questions you might have in the Q&A feature on Zoom, which you can find usually at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get to those towards the end of the session. We have about probably 10 minutes for Q&A. So please enter those throughout. And I also wanted to remind folks before we get started that this session is being recorded and will be available afterwards and will be sent out to all registered participants. So if you know folks who weren't able to make it today, you'll be able to share this webinar with them. So if you scan the QR code on the screen, you can get to a whole variety of tools and resources that People for Bikes has to offer, including a link to sign up for our newsletter, how to sign up for and take advantage of People for Bikes advocacy alerts to learn about opportunities to support better biking in your community. You can also learn about programs like our City Ratings program that rates 2,500 communities throughout the world for the quality of their low-stress bike networks. Access tools like our National Bike Project Tracker. Check out our state and local legislative guide to help you advance infrastructure. And you can also see our data-backed talking points that are available to support the different kinds of legislative moves that we suggest at the state and local level. And of course, we have our guide to effective local bike advocacy, which we're going to dig into one aspect of today. Our guide to effective local bike advocacy, again, available at the link that this QR code will lead you to, focuses on 6 components of effective advocacy. First is messaging, which we covered in a previous webinar. The second is community engagement, also covered by a previous webinar. Today, as I mentioned, we'll be focusing on coalition building. And other things you can check out in our guide include equity in advocacy, building relationships through advocacy, and effective local leadership. So today, with our focus on building powerful, inclusive coalitions, we really want to focus on the idea of expanding the advocacy tent. We know, and folks who have been working in coalitions like our panelists know, that strong coalitions are the ones that collaborate with voices outside of bike advocacy. So some examples of groups you might want to consider partnering with if you're looking to build a new coalition or extend some partnership opportunities, pedestrian safety groups. You have a lot in common with them. Folks who are working on public transportation advocacy, things like public health and local business groups or chambers of commerce, youth groups. There are a whole variety, and you'd really be surprised how much bike advocacy has in common with all these different groups once you really get into it. So if you're thinking about forming a new coalition or expanding your coalition, some initial questions you might want to ask yourself, who's in your advocacy coalition? Who are you representing and who are you maybe leaving out of the conversations? Does your coalition really represent everybody who rides a bike in your community. So not just avid cyclists, but folks who consider themselves just casual riders, people of all ages and all abilities, and really everyone who lives in your community, no matter what neighborhood they're from and what their background is. And not only are those folks part of your coalition, but are their voices actively being heard and listened to within your coalition? And one great thing to think about is what the other groups are working in similar space in your area, just sort of listing them out and going through and thinking about what you might have in common with them. We know that broad coalitions work because they help develop stronger, broader messaging. And again, you can see our messaging webinar for more information on that. But really, it helps you broaden the appeal of your work and make it easier for more people to relate to it, people who might not even ride a bike. It helps you appeal more to decision makers and politicians. They're going to be more likely to listen to a broad coalition that they know represents hundreds or thousands of community members than a smaller niche group. And it's also going to bring a whole lot of new expertise in the mix, new funding opportunities, new networking opportunities. So it's a really great way to expand your influence and lead to more effective outcomes, more pro-bike policies being passed, more great places to ride being built. And before we hand things over to our panelists, just some tips to keep in mind. One being, and perhaps the most important, is that partnership is a two-way street. We have a saying here at PeopleForBikes within our organization that we put others first, and that is how a good coalition should always work. You're not just looking to bring folks into the fold to help you advance bike advocacy. You need to show up for them too and what they're advocating for. Developing a clear vision and goals with your partners is going to be really helpful to keeping you all on track as a large coalition. Making sure that you're recognizing and respecting folks from diverse cultural perspectives within your community, from different backgrounds. And the last tip we have is to celebrate the wins, even small ones that seem insignificant and maybe not worth celebrating. It's going to help you keep the momentum going, show progress that you're making, and keep everybody that's part of your coalition and contributing to it enthused about moving forward. So it's, one thing to talk about the challenges and the things you need to advocate for, but celebrating the wins that you've all made together is a really critical part of coalition building. So with all of that said, I'm so pleased to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Maggie Zerwinski, who is the Director of Community Development, the Director of Community Building and Leadership at the Active Transportation Alliance in Chicago. At the Active Transportation Alliance, Maggie leads advocacy programs and trainings to help community members develop the skills and access the resources they need to strengthen active transportation in their community. Maggie, I'm going to hand over control of the slides to you. And I think you're still muted, Maggie.
Sorry about that. For some reason, when I got control, I was unable to unmute. So I'm going to request control again. So apologies.
No worries.
All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Schwinski from the Active Transportation Alliance, and I'm here today from Chicago, the city of Chicago, and representing the Active Transportation Alliance. We're a nonprofit. We advocate for walking, biking, and transit in the Chicagoland region, and we fight for walking, biking, and transit to promote equitable, sustainable communities. Our region includes 7 counties around Chicago. 284 cities and villages are in that region, and we represent about 8.5 million people. And we also do work not only in our region, but also statewide in Illinois. Here. All right, so our coalition work, I would say over the last few years, this is becoming more and more important to our work. So we've definitely realized there's strength in numbers. And I think one of the reasons it works so well in transportation is that transportation touches everyone's lives. And so we've been able to find a lot of partners around the region and around the state who share similar goals. So we've been able, through our coalition work, we've been able to bring together a diversity of voices and interests that helps us amplify our advocacy efforts. And it's definitely, as Martina mentioned, brought in different expertise and skills and viewpoints. So we're definitely harder to ignore. We've used a lot of coalition work in local regional plans and policy work, as well as statewide initiatives. And I'm going to talk briefly about a handful of different coalitions that we're involved in. A moment, trying to change my slide here. For some reason I'm not getting my slide. Okay, whoop. All right, there we go. So statewide, a big coalition we're involved in right now is the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. And this is a group of, it's made up of hundreds of environmental advocacy groups, businesses, community leaders, faith-based organizations, student groups, environmental justice groups. And this particular coalition back in 2021 was really instrumental in passing a bill called the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, which was really about clean energy for the state. And now, starting last year, one of the big focus areas is on transportation. And here, these organizations listed here are some of the leaders in the transportation space. And what we're working on right now is there's a bill out there, or an act called the Clean and Equitable Transportation Act, CETA for short. And it is a package of bills. So one is focused on transit, public transit. It's related to the transit fiscal cliff. So it's really looking at how do we reform transit funding, make sure we're funding our public transit system, reform service, reform the governance. And then another bill that's part of this act is a bill focused on greenhouse gas emissions. So it's looking at greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. And the goal is to have zero emissions by 2050, and to realign state spending. So we're focused more on funding sustainable modes of transportation like biking. And this particular bill is based off of laws and work that's been done in Minnesota and in Colorado. So we're very excited about these bills. And another component of this act is looking at the electrification of vehicles. And with this huge coalition, it's really been amazing to see like how much power we have with so many groups and how many people we can reach throughout the state. And this past January, so last month, the coalition members hosted a lobby day at our state capitol, led by the Illinois Environmental Council. And through all of these coalition partners, we were able to bring a few hundred people to the Capitol to kick off the legislative session and really make transportation a key focus, so that our senators and representatives are that transportation's top of mind for them. So another alliance that we're involved in is the Illinois Alliance to Promote Opportunities for Health, led by the Illinois Public Health Institute. And this particular coalition is really about strengthening partnerships between public health and transportation. And what I've experienced in my work as a planner, as an advocate, is that a lot of times on plans and policy work, public health professionals are not often at the table. And we found that they have a lot of data. They're very much aware of traffic fatalities and chronic disease and air quality, and that's very much connected to sustainable transportation. So this coalition is all about creating more connections and building relationships between the sectors. And recently, so our state is working on an active transportation plan, and public health is at the table here. And now within the plan, some of the goals include health components like reducing chronic disease and enhancing safety. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about some regional and local work that we're doing. So one is leadership building. So this is a little different than coalition work, but I wanted to mention it because it's creating some coalitions and some new nonprofits. So we have a few different programs, but one that I'll focus on right now is called Bike Walk Every Town, which is all about bringing suburban advocates in our region together. And this began about 8 years ago, and now we have monthly calls that we host to connect people together, because it is like a large geographic area. So we have Zoom calls, and we provide updates to transportation advocates, or often bike advocates, about what's going on throughout the state and the region. And then we hear from them about what's going on locally. And it's a kind of, we create a space for people to brainstorm, ask questions, share ideas, ask for support. And it's been creating a community to support others. And what we've seen is some local coalitions have developed where a suburban community connects with a neighboring suburban community, and suddenly they start connecting with other neighbors, and then they've got a little coalition, a local regional coalition building. And we've seen some groups, some individuals decide to create their own nonprofits focused on walking and biking often. So that's been a great tool for coalition building in a way. And I wanted to also mention how this group has really helped us advance some of our own campaign goals. So back in 2019, we had a goal to establish $50 million in state funding for walking, biking, and trail projects. And through efforts throughout the state, but I would say those suburban advocates we've been working with, they definitely rose to the top, and they were connecting with our state leaders via meetings, calls, emails, made over 3,400 connections. And we were able to pass a bill where now we have $50 million in annual funding for walking and biking projects, and 25% of those funds go to high need communities. So just an example of what those connections and those relationships have helped us to achieve. And also, lastly, I wanted to talk about a couple other coalitions that we're co-chairs of. So one is called the Safe Streets for All Coalition. And this group, it's a group of not only biking organizations, but some other groups, like some neighborhood groups and disability groups, that are demanding better infrastructure and policy for Chicago to create safer streets. And then there's a coalition called the Transportation Equity Network, which often they call 10. And this is a coalition of about 50 groups. It's civic groups, it's environmental advocacy groups, it's mobility justice groups, it's many groups that don't necessarily directly focus on biking or transportation, but it's again a realization that transportation touches their networked lives in some ways. So they really work to embed racial equity and mobility justice into transportation, so into planning, into policies, into decision making, into funding. And they've been a very powerful voice that has lifted up a lot of community members' voices who often aren't at the table, who often aren't heard. So just some examples of some great coalitions that we're fortunate to be involved in. That again, and I wanted to mention one last campaign that we've worked on that these coalitions have really helped drive forward. And this is an ongoing campaign, but in Chicago, along our lakefront, we have about 15 miles of highway as well as a trail along our lakeshore. And there was a redesign project. It's called the North DuSable Lakeshore Drive Redesign Project. And there's been a lot of pushback against the redesign, because the issue that a lot of groups have is that it's prioritizing cars and kind of just creating a status quo for the current highway along the lakefront. And so we, through a series of phone calls and meetings with many different groups representing many different viewpoints, we came up with a letter to say what we wanted. And it was interesting in the beginning because everyone had a different idea of what they wanted to see on the lakefront. Some people are like, well, I'm focused on transit. I want to see bus rapid transit along the drive. Some people are really focused on biking. They want to see a bike boulevard, no cars along the drive. Some people are more focused on the water issues or the park space. But we were able to come together, about 20 different organizations, and we decided, we were like, all right, what do we all have in common? What, like, we're again more powerful together, and we don't like where this project is going. So what can we do together? So we wrote a letter to call for the halt of the redesign and restarting with a broader vision. And so this is really happening in the fall of 2024, but through this coalition work, we about a dozen Chicago City Council members wrote a letter also opposing the project. There was a resolution from the Illinois General Assembly calling for a non-highway alternative, and we hosted a rally with over 200 attendees. So the message is really getting out there. So we definitely see some wins here, and it's ongoing, but definitely inspiring to see like so many groups coming together with different perspectives and different ideas all coming together to support a safer, more sustainable drive in Chicago. So that is all I have. There's my contact information. So thank you again for having me, and I'll pass it on back to Martina.
Thank you so much, Maggie. And if you relinquish control of the slides, great. We can have our next speaker take control. So our next speaker, Kali Krompos, joins us from the Washington Area Bicyclist Association in Washington, D.C., where she is the Advocacy Director. She also previously served as the Capitol Trails Coalition Manager, so I think it's safe to assume that she knows quite a bit about coalition building. We're so excited to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Well, everybody, I am so excited to be chatting with you, and I think you'll hear a lot of similar themes that you've heard from Martina and Maggie. But want to start out with a quick overview of WABA, or the Washington Area Bicyclist Association. So we are really thinking broadly about active transportation and mobility. Our goal is to make sure that people have the opportunity to ride bikes, build connections, and transform places. And we're really thinking about lots of ways to give people options for getting around for recreation and transportation. WABA works regionally. We are focused across Northern Virginia, DC, and the surrounding counties in Maryland, covering 6 jurisdictions, as well as lots of federal jurisdictions that also play a role in this region. So a little bit more about what WABA actually does. We host classes for kids and adults. We host rides. We do direct service and outreach. And of course, we do a lot of advocacy, connecting our community members with their decision makers. So the way we think about it is that those pieces, the elements that WABA is working to do, really play a role in that theory of change, that we are helping to build demand by teaching people and supporting them in their biking journey, and then also give them tools and serve as a conduit to connect our community members with the people who make decisions on their behalf. So we are trying to simultaneously build demand and the physical space that we need to create safe options for getting around. So we heard a little bit already about equity and how that really plays a role. We have shifted over the past many years to think really broadly about what does transportation equity mean. So when we think about it, we're really trying to focus on how are we ensuring that all members of our community, regardless of your identity, of where you live, that you have equitable options. So when that comes to transportation, we're really thinking about low stress, affordable, sustainable options for getting around that really focus on safety and that include lots of modes. So of course, active transportation, walking and biking, but also public transportation. Like you heard from Maggie, a lot of our work is really focused on specific elements. We're often working with partners across the region to advance specific bills, working in coalition around certain projects. So you can see here a couple examples of coalitions that we currently serve on, including the Transportation Equity Network and the People Before Cars Coalition, as well as coalitions that have formed around specific legislation. The Transportation and Climate Alignment Act, if you can see those tiny logos in there, and we're working with a wide variety of organizations that focus on transportation, active transportation, sustainable transportation, but also environmental and conservation groups, as well as some public transportation groups as well. As we look at some of those other groups that we're working in, our coalition partners include business groups like business improvement districts, as well as community stakeholder groups, where our groups of community stakeholders who may not have a particular focus in transportation, bringing their needs, their community members' needs to the table as we think about how do we better serve the broader community. WABA, of course, is also working in regional coalitions. We work really closely with statewide organizations that are building coalitions that are thinking about geographic diversity, thinking about urban and rural opportunities. And a lot of these are bike focused, but we're really thinking about how are we bringing in lots of different partners in that work. But today, I really wanted to focus on two specific campaign efforts that we have been working on in coalition. The first of which is the Transportation Equity Pledge. This was an effort that we kicked off in 2021 with the goal of uniting a broad variety of community partners to create a transportation equity pledge that we would encourage candidates running for elected office to sign on to, encouraging them to think about the needs of their constituents, and then to be able to use that pledge as an accountability tool once they were in office. So I'm not going to read through all of those, but you can see here that we work with our partners to develop a list of what are the different transportation equity needs that our broad group of partners thought were really important for elected officials to be thinking about for those candidates to weigh as they were considering their future role in office. And we're really proud of the group of coalition partners that we brought together. Of course, other groups thinking about transportation, but also groups really thinking about specific demographics in our community, from young people to older adults to specific community needs. We thought that that effort was really successful. We were able to encourage 68 candidates across the region to sign on to that Transportation Equity Pledge, including representatives from Montgomery County, Arlington County, DC, and Prince George's County. You heard before that I have gotten to spend some solid time with the Capitol Trails Coalition during my time at WABA. The Capitol Trails Coalition is a project that is a collaborative effort between lots of groups. It is currently staffed by me at the Washington Area Bicyclist Association with support from the Rails to Trails Conservancy. The coalition was formally founded in 2016 through a partnership between Rails to Trails Conservancy, the U.S. National Park Service, and WABA. So this, to me, is a great example of a coalition. We are thinking about regional representation. The goal of the coalition is to create a truly regional network of multi-use trails that will give everyone the opportunity to get around for recreation and transportation, better connecting those points of interest, be it schools, jobs, grocery stores, etc. Our vision is that we're really transforming public life. Right now, the coalition has a goal of completing that total network of 1,038 miles. Currently, we're about 51% done. So 51% of those trails are currently built, but the rest of those trails are already in the jurisdictional plan. So in our role on the advocacy side, we were really encouraging those elected officials and decision makers at agencies to stick to those goals and to prioritize funding to make sure that they continue to move forward. I think that we've been really successful as a coalition because of who our membership is. We have a broad variety of members that represent government agencies, corporate interests and business improvement districts, and lots of different community organizations. Of course, some of those are big groups, including some national entities, including Rails to Trails, the National Park Service, REI. But we also work with lots of more local groups that represent different community interests. Like you heard Martina say before, we're really thinking about public health. Where can we thinking about active living as a part of our effort? Where can we bring in sustainability and conservation? And I think it's been a really great opportunity to bring in government agencies who aren't specifically focused on transportation to the table to ensure that they are thinking about and working closely with agencies that are thinking about transportation. So examples like Parks and Rec, DC Health Department, and lots of others. Through that work, we have been really successful. One thing that we are really proud of is that our effort, working in coalition across these different jurisdictions, encouraged our local MPO, the Municipal Planning Organization, to really build out its own map of multi-use trails. So we are really proud of being able to demonstrate that this network is really viable, it's important, and that there's broad support for it. And we're encouraged by their adoption and continue to work with them to build out those networks. In terms of advocacy, we have been really focused on continuing to demonstrate support at the community level to encourage elected officials to prioritize funding and moving forward these trail networks across each county. We've done that by encouraging each local jurisdiction to sign on to a resolution for the priority trails within their boundaries. So right now, 5 of the 6 have approved regional resolutions committing to those priority trails and a commitment to continue to build out the network. We're going to keep working on that 6th one. But again, I think this is a place where our broad network representing lots of different voices has been really effective. It's also been really effective to have a broad array of voices as we think about how can we continue to fund these projects. At the federal level, one project that we are really excited about, still in progress here, was a $25 million RAISE grant for a regional project. This project will contribute to trail development across 3 counties, Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and the District of Columbia. Just really want to thank everybody. I know we'll continue to hear more, but wanted to just end with thoughts about the power of coalitions and the importance of bringing in lots of different voices.
Thanks so much for joining us and sharing your expertise, Kelly. I'm going to introduce our 3rd and final speaker today before we turn things over to a Q&A session at the end of this workshop. So a reminder for folks, if you have any questions for People for Bikes or for our 3 wonderful panelists, you can go ahead and type those right into the Q&A in your Zoom, and we will have a little session where we'll try to answer as many as we can towards the end of our time together today. So our 3rd and final speaker is Jose Antonio Zayas Caman. He is the executive director for Our Streets, which is based in Minneapolis. There, he has worked to develop reparative justice campaigns across the Twin Cities and the region. As the executive director of the organization, Jose is working to ensure that Our Streets continues to emerge as a national leader in advocating for streets that prioritize racial, climate, and economic justice for all. Fun fact, outside of the transportation space, I've learned that Jose is also a multi-Grammy nominated artist, so congratulations, Jose. And I also wanted to note that Minneapolis is rated as one of the top cities for biking per our city ratings program here at People for Bikes. So lots of valuable lessons. The work that they're doing there is clearly paying off with this coalition, and we can't wait to hear what you've been working on, Jose.
Thank you. And I'm gonna get a hold of the slides and we'll get going.
All right, there you go. You should have control.
Thank you. Well, appreciate everybody here. I prepared a slide deck that is very shareable, so I'm gonna do a high-level overview. There are many more slides than we can cover in depth here, and definitely want to open the door for follow-up questions or for any of you to reach out whenever you'd like. At our organization, as Martina was saying, We have a deep focus on walking, biking, and rolling, and public transit in terms of transportation, but we're delving even deeper to think about racial and class equity and how our work intersects with many different disciplines to provide holistic solutions that address some of the harms that have happened in the past. And so with that in mind, I thought I'd just start with a quick story. This is a map here of a neighborhood that existed in North Minneapolis, drawn by Clarence Miller, and it is he's a former resident of North Minneapolis, and these maps that he drew are the only record of a neighborhood that no longer exists that was removed to make way for Minnesota's very first Highway 55. And here we see another example of some of the outcomes of the devastation of highway construction or concentric infrastructure, the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, which is often considered one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the state of Minnesota. It also happens to be where the University of Minnesota is now. And you know, the story that we are trying to tell through the work is what was there and what happened and who was impacted in order for us to advance transportation solutions that really think critically about historic harms over the years. And this is a neighbor that we met in North Minneapolis talking about her memory of a neighborhood that is no longer there, and what life is like living next to a highway. In addition to that, we try to make sure that our communities and our partners understand that these decisions were intentional and they were primarily made at the expense of Black Americans in the US and, of course, immigrant communities later on. And this is our former highway commissioner in the 50s, basically talking to a congregation saying, we know that you're reasonable people and understand that someone has to pay the price of progress. And the story goes a little bit deeper. I always like to introduce racial covenants because they were used so effectively in Minnesota, which were put into deeds and basically determined who had access to land and property. And they worked so effectively in Minnesota that they changed the landscape of where immigrant people and people of color lived, and this is a sample of the Twin Cities region as racial covenants emerged and forced people of color to live in concentration. They ended up in the same areas where we now have all of our highways. Let's see. And this specifically impacted sort of 4 archipelagos where communities of color concentrate in the Twin Cities. The Rondo neighborhood is probably the most well-known. The Old South Side, traversed by 35, Cedar Riverside, where you saw that photo, and then North Minneapolis, what I was describing earlier. And we feel like this is an important part of the story that we're trying to tell, because transportation is basically a manifestation of policy decisions about how land was going to be used and distributed. This was also, of course, exacerbated by redlining and sort of the codification of race class across the Twin Cities and how that determined the kind of investments that followed some of these infrastructure decisions. And so here, just another anecdote of the kind of, I went one too far, but that's okay. The kind of scientific racism, let's just say, that was used to justify these decisions. So this, for example, is a commission that was made of Calvin Schmidt, and you can see how he describes the neighborhoods, middle class, the Gold Coast, but then the areas where there's high concentration of people of color, they're described as slums. And that directly informs the kind of transportation infrastructure that people in different communities get to enjoy and the quality of life that sort of stems from it. All right, let's start here. I am not able to get it to move. I don't know why. I apologize. I cannot get this slide to. I have done something and I can't, oh,
Oh, Jose, let me see if I can reshare. I'm not sure what happened there. Let's see.
okay,
All right, you should be back up and running.
thank you.
All right.
Great. Okay, so moving on, very quickly, we do a lot of highway removal work, and so we try to put forward information about how this infrastructure was sort of sold in the past. You know, it was this idea that it would improve the quality of life in communities and oftentimes create opportunities for um, flight. So basically, white communities could leave um, mixed neighborhoods and move into suburban neighborhoods where they can live in isolation. So here it is summarized. You know, the story that we want to depict is how our transportation infrastructure was sort of modeled and touted, but the actual realities that people are facing. So, you know, going back to the state of Minnesota as a whole, you know, transportation is one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. And you'll have to imagine where the highways lay here. But folks who live next to the concentration of car-centric infrastructure have to endure many health determinants that affect them deeply and, of course, inequitably across the Twin Cities. And so that includes air quality, asthma hospitalization rates, life expectancy at birth, of course, poverty, the economic value of properties and the businesses and along those corridors is worse. And homeownership, it's because of these land use, zoning, and then infrastructure decisions, we've ended up in a situation where homeownership disparities are some of the worst in the nation. Here it is sort of visualized in reference to racial covenants. You can see sort of the up down of property values. This directly aligns again with areas that are traversed by highway infrastructure. So the work that we try to do as an organization is really, when we think about coalition building, is think deeply about the different facets of impacts, whether it's public history, racial equity, economic equity, obviously climate, and transportation, and trying to put together intersectional work that addresses these issues so that we're bringing people into the ecosystem who might not necessarily, for example, know or care about transportation specifically, but are impacted by transportation and land use decisions. And also bring people in who are very conscious, such as yourselves, into spaces where there are communities that have been deeply impacted but continue to be overlooked. The other thing that we try to advance is, like, while it's important for us to think about electrification, how do we electrify our fleet and how that's deployed is just as important. And one thing that we try to remind folks of is that car access, so car electrification, isn't a silver bullet, because oftentimes where people are most impacted, they can afford electric vehicles the least. And so we try to be very conscious about advocating for solutions that help reimagine neighborhoods and communities in a way where people don't have to think about driving, but instead they can move very easily and quickly to their amenities and necessities. We provide examples of what's happening in other parts of the state. This is an effort that we partnered with before, and in particular try to highlight sort of the economic impact opportunities of making such changes in our communities and what it can do to think to deprioritize car infrastructure and prioritize the people who live in those areas. And so, you know, the idea behind this is to create spaces and build coalition that allow people to think about alternatives with clarity of vision and come together around something that's really inspiring to them. and make the work that we do accessible from different starting points. Not everybody is going to know about or care the way that we do as experts, but because they are impacted, if we find creative ways to bring them into the process, they will. The other thing to mention is that we're very adamant about making sure that there's community participation, co-participation, and in particular in the creation of policies and community benefit agreements that ensure that when we're advocating for improvements, which we know historically often lead to displacement and gentrification, that's not the outcome. And instead, we're advocating for all communities across the spectrum to enjoy the same quality of life that has been primarily afforded to white Minnesotans over the last couple of centuries. We do a lot of outdoor events, such as open streets. I'll have an ad here in a second. And in these, apart from asking people to engage with our advocacy, we also have opportunities for people to engage with public history, so they can see what was lost and how it was lost and how we're remembering, which gives us sort of a better sense of purpose and solidarity around the work we're trying to do. This is an example of a walking tour that we do in an area in North Minneapolis, which was devastated by the original highway, where people get to see what kind of buildings and lifestyle people enjoyed in an area where all you can see is a highway. We host these open streets events, and I think this is really important because I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with open streets events. We try to make sure that there's some purpose behind them in advancing these advocacy goals, but also we host the events in locations that wouldn't otherwise have the resources, so that we can amplify this idea that if we make investments in communities that have been devastated by past transportation decisions, they can thrive just as much as communities that have historically received more investments. This is another historical display of a different neighborhood. And then I think also as important, when we want to make our work accessible, we put together these visions based on community feedback. So it is easy for people to identify with the benefits and the outcomes that are being proposed. So we do these visualizations of neighborhoods and highway corridors, so folks can quite clearly and easily engage with these ideas. They don't necessarily have to be an expert on the work that we do. On top of that, we have worked with technical partners, and we try to model what is feasible and what it will cost and what are the impacts of this work. And obviously, these are different kinds of partnerships, but this is how we build our coalition to make sure that people can also visualize what's important to them. When you talk about infrastructure changes or improvements, they often will have questions of what about me? What about my house? Am I going to get displaced? What are going to be the impacts? So it's important for us to show what the potential of that work is. And just as much, as I'm sure all of you know and encounter, there's always questions about what about traffic? So we try to make it very easy for folks to understand, how does traffic evaporation work? How does induced demand work? So they can easily see, you know, this sort of basic fundamental concept of, if we add more lanes, people take more trips, there's more congestion, more pollution, whereas the opposite is true. If we change and repurpose the land and focus on other modes of transportation, develop housing and commercial property, if people have an easier time going out into the world and noticing that they can move in other ways, they will choose to move in other ways, or traffic evaporation. Because we work in highways a lot, again, try to make it easy and accessible for folks to understand what are some of the benefits, what are some of the differences, and how to engage with that sort of sometimes inaccessible high-level information, which also makes them better advocates for the kind of policies that we're trying to advance. But at the core and underneath all of the work that we do, we want to make sure that we're both challenging people who live outside the communities that we're trying to serve, and also the people who live within those communities who have ingrained views about transportation, to think about the pros and cons of the changes that we're trying to achieve. That this goes beyond small changes, that these can have generational impacts, the same as it's had on us. And so kind of going into the coalition building model that we're utilizing. All of our work is rooted in a lot of grassroots organizing. We do work at the Capitol. We do work in partnerships with subject area experts. But we also work with neighborhood associations and neighborhood entities, and we reach people individually door to door year round. And this is a very critical way in making sure that people are informed about what's happening, are informed about what's possible, and that our work isn't a reflection of our interests, but rather a reflection of the community's values, perspectives, and needs. And so with that, the Minnesota Community Over Highways Coalition sort of recently formed last year and is still taking shape. You don't have to read all of this, there's not a quiz at the end. But the important thing that I want to highlight about this, we modeled this visual intentionally to show that we're trying to invert the coalition building approach here in the state of Minnesota and model a coalition that is centered around impacted communities, bringing forward their concerns and their ideas, which then inform the work that we do with our partners and of course at the policy level to achieve change, so that ultimately all of the work that we're doing is in the service of those community members that often don't have access to have their voices heard in processes that have directly impacted them historically and disproportionately. That's all I have.
Thank you, Jose. That was so wonderful to hear more details about the work and the history and how that's impacted the work in the communities that you interact with. So some key takeaways for folks. Again, building a diverse coalition is going to bring more voices into your group. It's going to help you become stronger advocates. It's going to help you ensure equitable advocacy. It's going to help you continue to work with the people that live and work in the neighborhoods that are impacted by policies and projects that you might be working towards. And again, I can't drive this home enough. Like, it's so important to collaborate beyond bikes. That your advocacy work shouldn't just be about bikes. It should be about broader issues. You should integrate things like public transportation, economic development, public health, and a whole lot more. There's an endless world of possibilities of different angles for bike advocacy work, and we encourage you to explore those. So some easy steps you can take today if you're looking to do this kind of work in your own community. I encourage you to really reflect on your coalition or your group's existing composition. Think about any gaps or potential local partners that you might want to work with. Reach out to potential partners and start to share your goals and your vision and ask for theirs so that you can collaboratively start to identify areas of overlap that make sense. And then you're ready. I think from there, the next steps will be pretty obvious, and you can start taking action from there to make sure your advocacy work is effective and helpful for the folks that live and work in the communities you work with. With that, we're going to switch over to a few minutes of Q&A, and I think we've got about 8 minutes. So if you have not had a chance yet to add any questions to the Q&A, I encourage you to go ahead and do so at the bottom of your screen, and I'm just going to stop sharing there so I can see them. Great. So this first one, I'm going to read it, and then we'll see maybe who is the best person to take this one. Do you have any strategies for the last mile to help people travel from trails to their specific destinations? This person, Susan, says, we find that these short missing connections can really deter people from taking advantage of trails for transportation rather than only for recreation. So talking about those last mile connections. Do any of you have any tips to share about bridging those gaps?
Glad to kick it off. And Susan, please be glad to help connect you with some of the folks in our network who are really focused on those first and last mile connections. But I think something that has been really effective for us is that creating that network map helps us really identify those gaps. So I think for us, we continue to work to highlight those in our advocacy, especially pointing out where are there currently underserved communities that don't have access to parks, trails, and green spaces because they are lacking those really important connections. So as part of our work in the coalition, we are trying to connect community members with those advocacy opportunities to highlight their need, but would be glad to talk through more strategies.
And I would just add, I would say that that's definitely an often forgotten part in the planning process, making sure to connect trails into the transportation network so trails can actually be used for transportation. And I think with that coalition work or just having a lot of partners involved, it's been helpful on our end when we learn about a plan, like getting involved, at the very beginning, as soon as you're able, as soon as you're aware of a project. When we become aware of a plan, we try to get the word out to partners that we know are maybe in that area that could either themselves weigh in or have some of their network be aware of the issue. And again, and what Callie said about having a map is a great way to really highlight where the issues are.
Thanks for that, Maggie. Jose, is there anything you'd like to add to talk about any work that you've encountered with dealing with those last mile connections?
Yeah, so I'll say one thing. We took part of REAM's Transportation Academy program, and we did it once. And so one of the things we were able to do is sort of like we're working towards creating like an advocacy toolkit, because sometimes we get asked to help with things that we don't have capacity for. And basically it's like a one-off, we teach community efforts how to advocate for themselves. And so we had an instance where there was a very well-organized volunteer group doing bike rides and trying to connect two basically trails that traverse the whole city. And so I guess the point I'm making is like, I think we're going to try to work towards, and if you're, I don't know, representing organizations, a way to hand over, here's how you can do this advocacy work, or the way we would do it so that we can kind of stretch our capacity across these efforts that are super helpful. And then our job is just to kind of highlight it and amplify it.
Great, thank you. Those last mile connections are so critical because those kinds of gaps are not only what lead to major safety issues, and that's where people get killed. That's where people are hit by cars. But also that's what keeps a lot of people from riding. Just 1 or 2 blocks of dangerous riding on what might otherwise be a beautiful trail network could really keep someone from feeling comfortable riding. And so addressing those is of the utmost importance. All right, let's see what else we have here. We have, okay, let's see. Christy says, recently, my organization has been getting a lot of pushback from our city council on building multi-use trails and their benefit to the community. We'll be presenting that to them in 2 weeks. Oh boy. Do you have any advice on best practices? Maybe what types of information would resonate best with elected officials more than others? Does anyone want to jump in there?
I guess I'll say my 2 cents. Economic benefits, I think it's always a good thing to highlight. People who use other modes of transportation tend to spend more because they don't have those car-related costs. Obviously, health and safety, but climate. But the other thing I would say is bring community. I think city council members are very responsive to their constituents, like go and find constituents and bring them together and give them the opportunity to have their own voice in the process.
Thanks, Jose. I would add that, doing some research ahead of time, figuring out the folks on the city council or the committee that you're presenting to, find out what they care about. Are they really into public health? Are they really concerned about speeding on neighborhood streets in the community they represent? What's the angle there so that you can make a personal appeal to them and help them understand how it furthers something that they care about or they're campaigning on? behalf of. All right, we'll take one more real quick because we're running short on time. David has asked, so in Denver, public process around multimodal infrastructure projects has become somewhat corrupted, in my opinion, with organized anti-progressive neighborhood and other groups becoming increasingly vocal during community input meetings. Do any of you see this, and how are you dealing with it? I think it's something we've all in advocacy probably dealt with, is pushback at community meetings and folks having a voice at community meetings that maybe aren't representative of the entire community, but nevertheless being the most vocal. Any tips and tricks for overcoming that?
Do you want it really short? Education and activation. So people who often have time to show up at these things are often people of privilege who have those resources. If you can get people who are actually impacted by these solutions through education and organizing, then you can bring a counterweight to these processes. We definitely run into that all the time. Like if we don't do the organizing, we get a bunch of drivers who show up. And so in order to combat that, we have to go find folks in the community and give them the tools to feel confident in raising their voice.
Thanks so much. Oh, go ahead, Callie. Did you want to answer?
I was just going to underline what Jose said, and I think something that we have been trying to think about is really centering broader approaches, that we know that bike infrastructure is really about transportation safety for everyone. Having a protected bike lane is better for people walking on the sidewalk. It improves safety at intersections. I think we are trying to bring that messaging as well. And I think that has been helpful in bringing additional partners and community members who maybe are not comfortable biking yet, but as they think about broader transportation systems, might feel more included in that transportation vision.
And I would add just trying to get the word out as much as possible. Like we're like our groups kind of can act as the organizer to get the word out. And like it's definitely, I think it's a universal issue of like, people a privilege often showing up to the meetings to share their, like, often being against the change, but making sure the word gets out to encourage others to show up. And we've established some training programs to help give people that confidence and some tools to be willing to show up at a meeting, because that can be intimidating to some people, a lot of people, including myself. But I would say, like, another strategy I've seen some groups use is asking people, like, maybe they don't feel comfortable speaking, but everyone show up in a green t-shirt, and it can show like, oh, there's like a sea of green in the audience, and getting the word out that these are supporters of this bike project or this trail project can be like a visual way to show that there's support. Just one other idea.
Great tips and suggestions. We know it can be challenging. We so appreciate you all for joining us today and doing this hard work on the ground to make your communities better. We know it isn't easy, but we hope this advocacy series will bring you some advice from other folks doing the same work on the ground to make your life a little easier and more effective. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. We appreciate you sharing your wisdom with other folks doing this work throughout the country. And as a reminder, this webinar will be available to folks afterwards, so you'll all get a recording of this. Thank you so much.